thank you very much for inviting me back on your 25th anniversary. I was asked here in 2013, and I was just reflecting on what's changed since 2013. Quite a lot, of course, including my own ideas. And that's how I justify to myself, why am I coming back? An old guy in a young region, what new have I got to say? Well, my ideas over the last 2 years have profoundly changed. That's why you should read The Future of Capitalism. I don't mind if you buy it or not, but I would like you to read it, because it's full of, it's part of a sea change of new ideas, which is really bringing ethics back into the core of economics. It's not the only book that does that. There are 3 or 4 of them now by different authors, but The Future of Capitalism, that's mine. Now, the challenge facing the Meno region is pretty obvious, and it's it's quite daunting if you think about it. That here you've built an economy which is sustainable on large oil rents, but the large oil rents are now going to be a thing of the past. And so you've got falling oil rents and rising population, and so there's a slow crisis of sustainability. You've not got a cliff edge, but you need profound change in order to provide rising living standards for the mass of the population instead of falling living standards. So that's the challenge, that's pretty obvious. And what I'm going to talk about are the two components of it. One is about how do the mass of the population change, how do they get equipped to be productive? And that's about productive jobs. Right? It's very obvious that it's needed, and I'll try and sketch what has to happen to make that happen. But then there's a deeper process, which is that in order for that to happen, the institutions and ideas in the whole Meno society have to undergo radical change. And that is a much larger societal transformation. And so I'll start with the mechanics of productive jobs and then turn to this larger issue. So the mechanics of productive jobs. 5 conditions, all of which have to apply in sort of ascending order. And the most elementary transformation in making people productive is that you need proper firms in which people work. I work a lot of the time in Africa, and Africa is desperately short of proper firms. What do I mean by a proper firm? I mean an organization with the capacity to organize a workforce so that workers reap economies of scale and economies of specialization. Yeah? So you need, it doesn't mean people have to work in a firm of 10,000 people, but they can't work in a firm of 3 people. Yeah? And in the end, firms will very largely need to be subject to the discipline of market competition, and that means the firms are either private firms or compete with private firms. Right? So if they're public sector, they've got to be on a level playing field competing with private firms. So vital that Meno has enough firms that can do scale and specialization to employ the vast bulk of the workforce. And at the moment, you're not there. A big chunk of the workforce is either in small-scale informal employment, not enough scale and specialization, or it's in the public sector, not in the market economy, not facing the rigors of competition. And so that's the first transformation. You need a lot more firms, a lot more workers working in proper firms. Second, firms cluster together, and they cluster together partly because some of the scale economies are reaped at the level of the spatial cluster rather than a single firm. Right? My favorite example is a city called Kaitao in China, which produces 2/3 of the world's buttons. And why are 2/3 of the world's buttons made in this city? There's nothing special about the city. It's just that 2/3 of the world's button makers are all there. And so making buttons, because there's so many firms there, is a lot cheaper. Right? It could have been anywhere. Right? So that's the cluster. So it's partly a lot of firms doing the same thing, but then it's also a lot of firms doing things that are interdependent. So it's exactly the same scale and specialization that occurs within a firm occurs in a cluster. So, for example, London is a cluster of different specialisms, all in the sort of nexus of finance and law. Right? So there's a mass of very different specialist firms, but they're all interdependent. Because they're all there in a cluster, the transaction costs are much lower than if they were all spread apart. So you need firms, you need clusters. Third, you need a workforce that is trained up to the skill levels that the firms in the cluster need. Right? And that does not happen through a market process. That's a very important point to recognize, right? That markets, labour markets, fundamentally fail in the task of training workers in the complex skills that firms, high productivity firms, need. Right? The market doesn't work. Firms have an incentive to free ride rather than train. Let's poach existing trained workers rather than train. And workers, if a firm does invest in training, have an incentive to quit and find a firm that hasn't spent the money on them and so is willing to pay them more. Right? So the private incentives, both of workers and of firms, don't produce a highly trained workforce. That's where public policy comes in. It has to be done through public policy, but the training cannot be done by the public sector alone, because the public sector is too divorced from what firms need. And so you have to build a rather complex structure in which the public policy basically forces the firms to spend money on training. A good model here is Switzerland. My own country, Britain, is completely hopeless at this. We've got 3 of the top 10 universities in the world, but for training of the ordinary labour force, we're hopeless. Right? Switzerland also has a top 10 university. 60% of the workforce doesn't go to university, goes through 4-year vocational training courses. It's paid, it's prestigious, and half the costs are paid for by firms, who therefore make very, very sure that the people coming out are employable in the firms. Right? So that's the third layer, producing trained workers. The fourth layer is trained firms. You need firms to keep up with the international competition. And that is also something that requires public sector intervention, because a lot of the research that's needed to keep up with the competition is research that's best done in universities. You know, firms are just too near market. They can't spend the blue sky research money that actually pushes the frontier. And so you need, as part of this cluster, to get the research departments of the pertinent departments of universities to work with the firms in the cluster. And it's a two-way interaction, because the university researchers learn from the experiments that the firms are doing, and the firms learn from the theories and laboratory work that the universities are doing. So you train your workforce and you train your firms with public sector interventions. And then finally, you need a structure of authority that actually delivers all that. And that means that an opposite process has to happen amongst firms in a locality and amongst government. Essentially, firms, their natural instinct is to compete with each other. But in a cluster, you actually want them to cooperate for the labour training. Right? And so you need to build institutions which which encourage firms to interact and cooperate at the local level. The country that's done that best is Germany. Purely by a fluke, they didn't mean to do it, but it worked basically because they managed to keep finance decentralized, so the German banks function at a local level. Because the finance functions at a local level, the business community tends to get organized at a local level. So, business, you need to try and bring together so that there's a business organization, a functioning business organization at the level of the city. And then government, you have to do the opposite process of trying to decentralize government. Government, most countries, nationally, power gravitates to the top. Nationally centralized decisions. But actually government needs to be decentralized so that the cluster has a government which has the power to take decisions. Right? So you aggregate firms together at the level of the city, and you decentralize government down to the level of the city. That's the trick. And once you've got that, you've got local government, local universities, and local firms all working together to train a workforce, to keep abreast of the technology frontier, and to make sure that the infrastructure of the city gives you the basic connectivity and energy that the cluster needs to sustain itself. And that will be a continuous process. It's not do it once. It's that all the time, globally, there's change. And a good cluster is keeping abreast of that change, finding little problems that come up, and pragmatically building appropriate responses to those problems. So it's a continuous learning, error correction process. That works in some places. In America, Boston, I just came from Boston on Friday, and that's a good example where you've got this mixture of local firms organized together, quite a powerful local government, and of course a major cluster of universities that work with the firms. In Britain, the only part of Britain other than London is Edinburgh, which does this. By pure chance, Edinburgh has a lot of local power, because power's been devolved to Scotland. And Edinburgh's the capital of Scotland, and so Edinburgh happens to have a lot of power relative to other cities in Britain. It has a good university which has for 50 years seen its job as local. And it's because the Scottish business community is organised separate from the English business community, and the Scottish business community happens to be based in Edinburgh, fortuitously it's got a local business cluster which works with the university and the local government. 10 years ago they decided to build a new sector, and they chose a part of the IT sector. When they started that, they had only 2 firms. 10 years later, they've got 480 firms. It's the biggest cluster in Europe in that field. Right? So these things can work in real time once you get them going. So, and in Asia, an example will be Singapore. So there are examples of what works. Meno doesn't start from there. Right? Meno starts from a very different place. Your firms, as the very good new book by Diwan and Malik shows, your firms tend to be crony capitalism. That is to say, they make their money not by being at the frontier of productivity, but at the frontier of the door to the minister's office. Right? Your young workers, your most educated young workers, what do they aspire to do? Do they aspire to work in a really good, productive firm? No. They use their education as a credential to get into the public sector. Right? And meanwhile, your government is very highly centralized in a sort of command and control way at a national level. Right? So at the moment, you don't start from a structure which is conducive to these clusters. That means you're going to have to go through a big transformation. So that's what I now want to turn to in the second part of my talk. 10 minutes or so? So, all transformations, which is in this case it's a transformation from a centralized rent-seeking society to a decentralized productive society, all transformations are unique events. It's very important to understand this. Every country is different, and these transformations only happen once in any country. So they are unique events. All unique events are subject to radical uncertainty. By definition, right? If they're unique, you can't say, oh yeah, we recognize this, it's going to go just the same as all these other events which were the same, right? But if it's unique, you can't do that, right? And so you can't, because it's a unique event, radically uncertain, you can't plan it in detail. Right? Now, this is why I'm a man who is under danger of death threats, because the consultancy business globally, McKinsey and Boston Consulting and what have you, lives by selling very fancy transformation plans to anxious governments. And in my view, it's snake oil. Right? That there is no way that you can plan in any detail a unique transformation. Right? What you've got to think is a very different question. It's not, here is the plan between now and the next 30 years or whatever. Right? What you've got to ask is, what sort of structures in society do we need that will be able to navigate through a very uncertain process, so that each time we make a little mistake, first of all, we've got to do 2 things. We've got to get as much learning as possible, as much change as possible, but we've got to learn from experiment. And so it's, and let me give you the example of the most astonishing change in my lifetime. which is obviously China. Yeah? China, the last 40 years. It's completely astounding what happened in China. Yeah? No society has ever transformed so successfully anywhere in the world, ever in human history. And how did that happen? It didn't happen through a grand plan. There was no grand plan. Quite explicitly, there was no grand plan. Right? If you look at what Deng Xiaoping did, he navigated by two principles which he became very standard public principles that every Chinese knew and knows. And one was that he said, the process of change is like feeling your way across a river, stone by stone. Stone by stone, you feel your way as you ford your way across a river. You don't build a bridge and walk across it, that's the grand plan. You feel your way as you go. Right? And the other was this wonderful phrase, came out in 1979, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches the mice. Right? What did that mean? It's quite unambiguous. It meant pragmatism. Right? We don't mind whether it's capitalism or communism. All we care is, does it work? Right? And so it was a move away from ideology, which in China was astounding. China, until Deng, had been the most ideological society in the world, disastrously so. Right? A thing called the Great Leap Forward, which was better known as the Great Leap Backwards. Right? I teach this course the ideas I explained to you, and so one of my graduate students who was Chinese, obviously thought, oh, is this guy Collier just talking rubbish? All this about narratives that change ideas. So he sent a survey, a questionnaire, round all the Chinese students in Oxford, and there are a lot of them, believe me. And his question was just, what best describes Chinese economic policy? And 2/3 of them came back with exactly the same response, which was, it doesn't matter whether a cat's black or white as long as it catches the mice. So 40 years after Deng had uttered this narrative, the most sophisticated young people in China still navigate by that narrative. And it's astounding. That's the power of narratives to change ideas. Now, Meno is not China Mark II, because you're not starting from the same place. Right? China started, like many East Asian societies, through a combination of very low wages, because it was a very poor society, so very low incomes, but a very strong state. Right? You start from an opposite configuration, rather high incomes and rather weak states. Right? So you can't just copy what China did. Right? But you do have to change. Right? The present structure is unsustainable. So how do you embark on change? You don't literally copy China. Well, you need to change your institutions, but above all, you need to change the norms in the society. There's been a lot of emphasis, overemphasis on institutions in economics the last 10, 15, 20 years. It's all supposed to be institutions. It clearly isn't, because the Nobel Prize winner Douglas North, who I greatly respected, but he came out with one famous phrase which has done a lot of damage. He said, institutions are the rules of the game. And that sounds right until you think about it. But actually, rules are the rules of the game. Right? Institutions are teams of people. And how an institution works depends upon the ideas in the heads of those people. So you can have the same design of institution in different societies, and they function totally differently because the ideas in people's heads are different. Right? And that's why change is not just about institutions. It is about institutions, but it's predominantly about changing the ideas in people's heads. Leaders, political leaders, rarely have enough power to change a society by command and control. That's the bit that leaders like to do, issuing orders. No leader has enough power to achieve their objectives. None. Right? All leaders need to have the willing compliance of a lot of citizens in order to achieve their objectives. Right? Building that willing compliance around a purposive agenda, that is the fundamental task of leadership. And in doing it, leaders are not primarily commanders-in-chief, they are communicators-in-chief. How do leaders communicate? Two ways: what they say and what they are seen to do. What they say, very powerful. We know that most people understand their world through narratives. Narratives are much easier to remember than anything else. Right? So narratives, stories, are how people understand their world. Right? Black cat, white cat is a narrative, a little image. So narratives combined with visible actions. Well, economics has already developed a theory of how to use visible actions. That's Michael Spencer's theory of signaling. And this tells you how visible actions and narratives can fit together. Visible actions are very good at building credibility if you use them rightly. And that's because visible actions can be costly to the guy doing them. If you remember, Michael Spencer's theory of signaling is that if you want to convince somebody that you mean what you're saying, you have to do something which will be so costly if you didn't mean what you were saying that you wouldn't do it. Right? So you take some statement. I want to reduce corruption. Every leader says that. When Lee Kuan Yew came into office in 1961, that's what he said: I want to reduce corruption. Right? The question is, do people believe you? Right? They listen and say, yeah, well, he would say that, even if he's a corrupt guy, even if he means to run the place by corrupt patronage. He'll say, I want to reduce corruption. So you need a costly action. Well, fortuitously for Lee Kuan Yew, he got the opportunity to do a costly action because just as the Ford Foundation is your main financial backer, let's say, Lee Kuan Yew, here's my main financial backer for my election campaign, which I've just won. I'm just a poor lawyer, but this gentleman here has financed my entire election campaign and I've won. That was the situation Lee Kuan Yew found himself in 1962. And then he discovered that, I'm afraid, my main financial backer is corrupt. So what do I do as Lee Kuan Yew? Do I say to you, please keep it quiet, do it under the table, not over the table? Right? No. What Lee Kuan Yew did was jail you. Right? That was a very costly public gesture. You jail your main financial backer, he's not going to back you anymore, and probably no other financial backer is going to be very keen either. Right? But it convinced, it was a powerful signaling action. Right? So that's the power of visible actions to persuade. Why then do you need narrative language as well? Because narrative language gives you much greater scope for precision. That's why all societies have developed language. Language gives you precision of meaning. And so you combine a visible action that gives you, if you like, a zone of credibility. I could mean a range of things. And then, as long as you're within that zone of credibility, narrative language will nail it. This is what I mean. So that's the technique. What do you use it for? You use it for three simple narratives, three simple ideas. One is you try and persuade people that they have some overarching shared identity, which in the Meno region is not difficult. You need a big we. Second, you need a causal proposition. If we all do this, which none of us individually wants to do, but if we all do this, we're all better off in the future. Right? And then you need a normative proposition. Therefore, you should esteem people who do this action and don't esteem people who don't. Right? So you're rewarding, you're giving and withholding esteem on the basis of what people do. Right? Now, a lot of societies start from the basis of rewarding esteem on the basis not of doing, but of being. Right? You esteem people who, as it were, are important rather for being something rather than for doing. And so the big cultural shift is to shift the basis of esteem from being to doing. Now, what do you want people to do? You want them to acquire the skills that make them productive in a firm. Making that psychological change from a society that esteems being important, having an important job in the public sector, to esteem of doing something. And the key step you want is get prestige from training to be productive in a firm. You need a vanguard that will make that change, the vanguard of people who will be the first to change, who will lead change. And who in the Meno region should be the vanguard? Quite obviously, it needs to be youth. And so you need to target these messages. A shared identity, purposive action. Equip yourself to be productive. And then the norm, you get esteem if you're going through that process of training rather than if you're aspiring to be important, as it were. That's the message for youth. Let me draw to a close, but I'll return to the example of China and say this is how China changed ideas. One, they built a big we. And the big we was around a sense of we're all in a common endeavor to be proud of China. That's where we want to end up. We all share this task of trying to have a common endeavor to build a strong China. China was humiliated in the early 20th century. We want to live down that humiliation. We want a strong China. Then they built a process of rapid social learning. And they did a rapid social learning by decentralizing political power to the provinces, but saying and sending out young cadre of party officials and saying, if you don't innovate in the first 6 months, you failed. So they'd agree some objective, say, we don't know how to do it, just go and try. So, shared objective, strong China, common process, innovation, social learning. Third, if you're going to learn from experiments, you need to evaluate the performance. And then the hardest thing for China was the decentralization, making it actually real. This highly centralized society that they said, no, we're going to let go at the center. You go and try things. We won't punish you for trying. We'll actually punish you for not trying. You're not China, but in some respects, you've got more advantages. It's easier for you to do this than it was for China. Yeah? And your big advantage is that you are naturally decentralized across this region. You're fortunate that you don't have an overarching Middle East authority that runs the whole region. Right? And so you're naturally designed for experiment. Different things will happen in different countries automatically. So there's your strength against China. It was very hard for the Chinese leadership to persuade people that it really meant it. That this region could do this and that region could do that. Very hard to persuade people. Right? For you, that's easy. What's harder for you than China is the learning from experiment. You will naturally have a lot of experiment. But China, because it was so centralized, once it got experiment, it was very easy to learn from the experiment and spread the ideas around, because it was so centralized. And what Meno lacks, or has lacked, is that capacity to learn from what's happening elsewhere in the region, bring those ideas together and spread them. You need more organizations at the Meno level that do that evaluate what's happening in different parts of the region and then spread the evidence around the region. And you can learn equally well from things that work and from things that don't work. Eh? Examples of failure are just as useful as examples of success. Not everything has to succeed. It won't. Right? Now, that is why I was so proud and pleased to come back to the Economic Research Forum, because that is exactly what you are. Right? You remember the big three firms, local government, and tertiary education sector. The tertiary education sector, which is both responsible for training and for the research ideas. Right? So here's the Arab world's network of this tertiary education sector for the social sciences, and especially for, the queen of the social sciences, economics. And you're 25 years old. You've spent 25 years building this organization, which now has the capacity to evaluate experiment around the region and share that evidence across the region. Right? So, you've built the organization that Meno needs. In the next 25 years, it will be the decisive period for Meno, when you reposition yourself from this rent-living society to a productive society. So, it's taken 25 years to build Meno. The next 25 years is the vital period when you use it. Thank you very much.